It's 9 o'clock and we have a very busy agenda for today, so we will start here and hopefully there will be some more people calling in the meantime. It's my pleasure to welcome everybody to this webinar, which is the first joint activity of a new CSO network called Green Aid. This was formed in the spring and is so far an informal collaboration between some 20 Swedish CSOs in the development cooperation sector. My name is Göran Eklöf. I work at WWF Sweden and I will be facilitating this first day of these 2 half-day seminars. We will have 2 days to look into the issue of biodiversity and its great importance as a factor behind human development and well-being. Biodiversity, when people hear about it, maybe they associate with charismatic mammals or some exotic bugs, but it is so much more. Ecosystem, species and genes that make up biodiversity are at least as important as stable climate for human development. We will be looking into 2 parts. The first day today, half day, will be focusing on what biodiversity is, the different dimensions of biodiversity, the trends, and why it is important to human development. And we will also look into some examples of from the field, from some of our organizations in the network, that how these work to preserve and protect and promote biodiversity plays out on the ground in different programs and sectors. And then we will also hear a little bit about an overview of what the development cooperation, Swedish official development cooperation, is doing in relation to biodiversity today. That will be the final session of today. Tomorrow we will dig a little bit deeper into the policies, institutions, and that manage and influence the biodiversity, and the platforms through which, with which civil society can interact and influence. Hopefully this will lead to better shared understanding of biodiversity issues and provide a basis for joint reflection on strategies and leverage points for civil society to engage. So a couple of very practical questions before I leave to the introduction by Marcus. Firstly, some people have asked why this is a Swedish CSO webinar. Why are we conducting it in English? And the simple reason is that we have people calling in from the offices of our Swedish development cooperation organizations in other countries. So we have a number of English-speaking participants on this call. That is why we have this dialogue in English. Secondly, as you may have noticed, you can only see a limited set of people who are presenting or managing this webinar. The 50-something people who have called in so far are not visible. This is in order to get a more focus on the discussions and not so much on who is listening. You will be able only then to interact through the chat, and you are encouraged to do so. You can put your questions and comments to the panelists and presenters in the chat, and we have assigned people who will also monitor the chat and lift pertinent questions to the panelists in the time that we have for questions and discussion. So with that, I think I can warmly hand over for some introductory words by Marcus Lundstedt, who is the Director for Media and Advocacy at We Effect, which is one of the organizations that has engaged with the Green Aid Network. Welcome, Marcus.
Thank you so much, Göran. Good to see you, and good to see that so many of you are participating, even though it's under very special circumstances. I would have loved to see you in the same room. I mean, it is an historic time that they're going through, and this crisis is affecting everybody, the people and the planet. And what we have seen in the Amazon about woods coming down and farmer leaders being killed in the shadow of this crisis is just staggering, and it's very, very, very troubling. But I think all of us can also agree that this crisis is showing that a good amount of change is possible. I mean, we've seen that the unnecessary aircraft are flying is more or less void. It's not happening anymore. That the climate is getting some breathing room. We're just hoping to see that this will be for an extended amount of time. But also seeing, I mean, here at WeEffect, and I guess you guys are seeing that too, that we're talking more across borders, and we are forced to solve problems in a new way. And we have, quite ironically, I would say, a joint purpose, and which is very, very acute. And I think that's moving us forward. And knowing that in the midst of all this, a new Swedish green network is formed to bridge the distance between the environment work and international development cooperation. I mean, that's a good thing. We have our different expert areas, WeEffect, WWF, and so forth. But we're at least we're closing in on one another, and we're trying to understand how we can be mutually beneficial, that we need to work together. And that the Naturskyddsföreningen, they released a report on protecting environmental defenders this fall, only a few weeks before WeEffect presented a similar, or launched a similar report. I think that was not a coincidence. It means that we're coming into the same nexus from two different areas, and understanding that we need to move forward to address these issues together. We know that nature is under attack, and also people that are defending nature and the biodiversity are under attack. I mean, in the invitation to these 2 workshop days, it's outlined that we are seeing an increased pressure on land and nature, and it's affecting already vulnerable people's rights the hardest. I would like to point out, yes, I'm the media and advocacy director at WeEffect globally. I'm not an expert in the environmental parts of things, but being a regional communications officer, which was my former position for WeEffect in the past years in Southeast Asia, I have seen, in fact, a great amount of examples of how economic development has been affecting the biodiversity in a negative way. I lived in Vietnam. It's called a tiger economy because they have a financial growth of about 7%. But ironically, given the name, WWF are saying that there are only about 200 tigers left in the Mekong area today. 20 years ago, that number was 1,200. So, I mean, where is the tiger economy really coming from? And in Vietnam and the countries around, we are seeing that plastic is flooding the oceans and flooding the rivers. We're seeing that the forests and habitats and grounds for indigenous people and small-scale farmers are being exploited for plantations of palm oil or industrial land. And this is in order to feed both domestic and foreign markets and their needs for goods. And amidst this so-called economic development, we're also seeing that China, they're financing their new Silk Road, their Belt and Road Initiative, and very, very rarely what they're financing in these countries, such as Vietnam or the Philippines, is not done with respect of nature or human rights. In Vietnam, however, and some other countries, I've also seen some positive aspects. I was actually just there for a few months of years, but during that time, there were more and more conferences and meetings and workshops like the ones that we're having in the coming 2 days about sustainability, about the environment, about not putting the environment out when we were talking about development. And sustainability was not only a CSR word used to kind of market more goods. It was actually sometimes integrated in the companies that were working there. I was actually seeing this up close, working with, for example, IKEA. I also saw some examples of other international corporations that were not doing this at all, but at least we could see that there was some light in the end of the tunnel. We could also see that quite amount of Vietnamese environmental organizations, by pushing for environmental law and for pushing for, say, sustainability, they were also erasing and pushing the boundaries for the freedom of speech. So they were using the environmental dialogue as a way of also extending their civic space. And I would say that now that we're all trying to build back a better world after the Corona crisis, I think we need to look at those positive examples as well. And this green network that's been formed now is one of those examples. And I think that the theme of today of biodiversity, I mean, it's extremely important for all development work that we're doing. I have worked in Eastern Africa for WeEffect and via agroforestry, and I've seen loads of challenges, and especially for the biodiversity. We're seeing forests being cut down to next to nothing, that the soils are eroded, and we're seeing that the productivity for the small scale farmers is going down. And obviously this is also affecting the biodiversity. And we know that some farmers are trying to make their soil come to life with imported goods, hybrid seeds, and chemicals. And this is very expensive, both for the small scale farmer, but also for nature. And amidst all this, now they're also seeing the locust invasion, and which is, believe what I've been told by experts, is also related to climate change. So this is all combined into a negative spiral. But in Eastern Africa, I've also seen some positive things. Via agroforestry and other organizations are working on agroforestry, planting trees and crops together. And that kind of sustainable farming is good for the insects, because it will pollinate and it will make the earth more nourishable. There will be more nutrients, and that will in turn make sure that food production is actually going up, regardless of the fact that you only have a few hectares of land. And that in turn will also increase resilience for crisis, climate change, and other natural disasters. So it's an example of how people and the planet can actually work together for a better world. There will be development, but not on the cost of nature, rather in partnership with nature. I think a very important function of this network is also to broaden discussion outside our traditional networks of development aid and the environment, where I'm hoping that there will be discussions and collaborations with decision makers and authorities. And an example that we are bringing into this is WeEffect's member organization, LRF, the Farmers Union of Sweden. And we have worked the past years on trying to highlight the threats against small-scale farmers relating to the environment where they exist with. And in the report, Cross of Death Farmers, Bonde med livet som insats, we released that one together. We had a panel together with LRF, trying to get some form of common ground where we can work on this together. And I think that is something that we need to build on moving forward. Talking to Göran before this meeting, we also talked about the fact that economic development and biodiversity has been and is a problem, and very relevant also in Sweden, of course. And in the small town where I grew up, Ljungskile, on the west coast of Sweden, 200 years ago, there were no trees left. For several hundreds of years, they have been cutting down trees to boil herring to make oil. And so the entire area of Bohuslän was practically treeless, and the trees that were needed to create jobs, to feed families. But today we have a different politic for the forestry, and at least we're seeing that in Bohuslän the trees are back I know they're not in the maybe back in the way that we want them to be, but at least there's there. And then it's a good example that reminds us of that mankind tends to do economic development on the cost of nature. We're putting nature in the fire, so to speak. But I think we should learn from these mistakes and see that we can actually combine development for people and the planet and for nature. Now, in the corona crisis, I think it's more important than ever to have these discussions. We know that 2030 is only 10 years away, and that the global development goals that are outlining how the environment and development should work together is really important. We know also that we're in a hurry. We don't have much time, and for me, and the encouragement to you guys is to work together. I think that's the only way we can do this. Now I'm going to wish you all good discussions, respect one another's ideas, and have a set for a goal that will be providing a good breathing ground for both people and the planet. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Marcus. After this introduction, I have the pleasure to introduce two prominent experts in the field of biodiversity, and one colleague, Maria Schultz, who's the Director of Oceans and Freshwater Department at WWF, but who has recently joined from a long career of working on these issues in a number of different positions and organizations. And also Torbjörn Ebenhard from the Swedish Biodiversity Center. He works as a research group leader at Swedish Biodiversity Center, and also has very much knowledge and understanding to share on these issues. And this session that we will proceed to now, we'll look at first the very basics. What do we mean when we talk about biodiversity? What are the different dimensions and what are the trends and so on and so forth, and also to look into some of the many ways that biodiversity is so central to the human effort and to human development. So I'm not sure who's starting. Maria, are you starting off? Or?
Yes,
Welcome.
I will start off. And I just wanted to say thanks for inviting us. And actually to start off, we would like to show a film of Greta before we give the presentation, and I think we will have some help to show this film.
Yes, I will show it shortly. For some reason, I can't start it. I can't start the film.
This is not a drill. My name is Greta Thunberg. We are living in the beginning of a mass extinction. Our climate is breaking down. Children like me are giving up their education to protest. But we can still fix this. You can still fix this. To survive, we need to stop burning fossil fuels. But this alone will not be enough. Lots of solutions are talked about. But what about a solution that is right in front of us? I'll let my friend George explain.
There is a magic machine that sucks carbon out of the air, costs very little, and builds itself. It's called a tree. A tree is an example of a natural climate solution. Mangroves, peat bogs, jungles, marshes, seabeds, kelp forests, swamps, coral reefs, they take carbon out of the air and lock it away. Nature is a tool we can use to repair our broken climate. These natural climate solutions could make a massive difference.
Pretty cool, right?
But only if we also leave fossil fuels in the ground.
Here's the crazy part. Right now, we are ignoring them. we spend 1,000 times more on global fossil fuel subsidies than on natural-based solutions.
Natural climate solutions get just 2% of all the money used on tackling climate breakdown.
This is your money. It is your taxes and your savings.
Even more crazy, right now when we need nature the most, we're destroying it faster than ever.
Up to 200 species are going extinct every single day.
Much of the Arctic ice is gone. Most of our wild animals have gone. Much of our soil has gone.
So what should we do?
What should you do?
It's simple. We need to protect, restore, and fund. Protect. Tropical forests are being cut down at the rate of 30 football pitches a minute.
Where nature is doing something vital, we must protect it.
Restore. Much of our planet has been damaged.
But nature can regenerate, and we can help ecosystems bounce back.
Fund.
We need to stop funding things that destroy nature and pay for things that help it.
It is that simple. Protect, restore, fund.
This can happen everywhere. Many people have already begun using natural climate solutions. We need to do it on a massive scale.
You can be part of this.
Vote for people who defend nature.
Share this video. Talk about this.
All around the world, there are amazing movements fighting for nature. Join them.
Everything counts. What you do counts.
Thank you so much for showing this video. And now I will try to share my screen with you. So what Torbjörn and I will talk about is what is biodiversity and why does it matter for people? And Torbjörn, I will give you the floor first, and then you have to tell me when I shall shift slides.
Yeah, I will. Thank you. And good morning, everyone. I'm Torbjörn Ebenhard at the CBM, Swedish Biodiversity Center. I'm also serving on the board of WWF Sweden, which I'm very proud of. It's a great organization. And I also assist the Swedish delegation to the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is now negotiating for a new, the post-2020 framework. Now let's see, I think there's a slide before that one, which we start with, this one. What is biological diversity? Well, that's not an easy matter. This is the definition given by the convention. And of course, this is a legal text that everyone has agreed to, the parties of the convention. But as you see, if you look at this definition, it's not really a scientific definition, it's description. It circumscribes a lot of things. And it gives no clue actually to how to measure it in a simple way. And there is actually no simple single way to express biodiversity in the quantity. There are lots of different ways of doing it, and you need to combine different measurements to be able to express biodiversity. It is context dependent. Depending on where you're working in the world, what kind of activities you're involved in, you need different kinds of measurements of biodiversity. Also, when you monitor biodiversity, you need to look at very many different kinds of quantities. And if we go to the next slide, you can see one reason for that, and that is the diversity, the variation we are trying to express here is showing itself at different levels of organization. Here we have a scale from the gene to the Earth, the planet. And at all of these levels, there is variation, except of course the planet. There is only one planet, and that is the limitation. That is why we're having this seminar. And at all these levels, we can express variability. I'm not going to talk about all of these. There are losses of biodiversity at all these levels. If you go to the next slide, we have an example from the species level. This is from the Living Planet report by WWF, the Living Planet Index, the Global Living Planet Index, which measures about 16,000 populations of vertebrates around the world, mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, and so on. The starting point for this study is 1970, so that is where the index is set at 1. And you can see since 1970, we have lost on average about 60% of population sizes of each of these species, the 4,000 species that are represented in this. This is just a sample of all different kinds of vertebrates in the world, of course, but still, it's a really depressing message seen here. Loss of 60% on average in the populations. And next slide, please. Looking specifically at mammals, the total biomass, that is the weight of all different kinds of mammals on Earth, including ourselves, the human beings, which is a mammal species, and all our domestic animals, the livestock and so on. We find that only 4% of that mass are actually wild mammals. 60% are livestock and 36% are us humans. There is a loss of about 82% in the biomass of the wild mammals. And if you look at the figures, then you realize that the total weight, the total biomass of all mammals have actually increased over a number of 100 years because we have put into so much more energy, mainly fueled by fossil fuels, into this biomass. That is what is feeding this great mass of mammals now, mainly consisting of humans and livestock. And the consequence of that is that the livestock and humans are actually now consuming more than half of the primary production of this planet, which is an enormous amount of energy and resources. Next slide, please. Looking at single species, this is the cheetah, which once had an enormous distribution in Africa and Southwestern Asia, which is represented here in the gray area. You can see that the present distribution in red has decreased. There are now small spots of distribution of this mammal. It has gone extinct locally in all other areas. And this is a very common pattern in most animals we have looked at. There are, of course, mammals and other animals and plants that have been increasing, and they have now greater distribution than before. And most of those organisms are benefiting from human activities, and many of them are what we call pests. They are the weeds and disease carrying animals and so on. So this is a very typical picture of what is happening to the distribution of many species. And if you take this kind of picture for all different species and add them together to see where have all the local losses been, you can see the next map. We go to the next slide. Are Maria awake? Are you awake, Maria? There it is. Yes, thank you. So here all these maps for single species added together, and marked in red here is the area where the losses of species locally has been the greatest. As you can see, the deep red part here, they are representing losses of more than 30%. These are not just the big mammals, the cuddly ones and so on. These are all different kinds of animals and plants around the world. And these species are actually the drivers of ecosystem functions. They make the ecosystem work. So these are the operators of the living world that we depend on. And here you can see the losses in these species around the world. Next slide, please. Many species have been critically endangered in this process. Many have already gone extinct. the present rate of extinction is way beyond. Different calculations show that they may be about 1,000 or 10,000 times higher than normal, the rate of extinctions in number of species per year. And I'll just click on that. These are the cuddly ones. You can look at the gorilla, for example, there and see it would be a disaster to lose any of these species. But this is just a small representation of all the animals that are now being lost. The next slide shows you a graphic of that. For all the mammals, birds and plants, any kind of animal and plant group that we have data, this is a picture of the degree of threat. We have different categories of threat. This is from the IUCN red list. The red, orange and yellow parts represent the proportion of the species stock for each group of animal and plant that are now considered to be threatened. The amount or the proportion is different in different groups, as you can see. But the average for these well-studied groups is about 25%. So a quarter of the species in these groups are being lost. There are many other groups of animals and plants that we have less data on. And people have guessed that the degree of threat is lower in them. So if we just assume that it is about half, let's say about 12.5% on average for all species, then that would mean, together with also the estimation that we have about 8 million plant and animal species, we would arrive at 1 million threatened animal and plant species on this earth right now. This is way beyond the gorillas and the elephants and the giraffes and so on. These are all the many different small, big, unknown animals and plants that actually drive the functions of the ecosystems, and they are being lost. The reasons for this, well, there are two main big reasons, the direct drivers. And the first one is land use change. That is the most serious one. It has been for several hundred years and still is, despite the climate change. So land use change, we see here a picture from Brazil, where the rainforest is being cut up into small pieces and then obliterated. The second factor is overexploitation. This is just an example from one species, the Atlantic bluefin tuna, but we see this story in so many different kinds of plants and animals around the world, that what has been a good resource that could actually feed people, be of use to us, is being depleted and loses its value. And of course, then also species may go extinct as a result. And this is not a new story. Scientists have been telling you this story for decades, but it has been a very difficult story to communicate. As you can see in the next slide, this is the way many scientists feel about this. We say this clearly and loudly, but it is not being received by many people around us. IPBES is an organization that was formed to address this problem. IPBES is an intergovernmental platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services. So it is formed by states. Right now, there are about 130 member states that participate in this work. And it is an equivalent to the climate panel. But instead of supplying data, independent data on climate, we do this for biodiversity and ecosystem services. And of course, the objective of this is to strengthen this interaction with the policy interface between the scientists and other knowledge holders. It's not just science this is about, it's also about indigenous and local communities and their knowledge that needs to be put to use. Not only when it comes to giving you different stories on how we're losing biodiversity, but also on how to actually address this problem and to find a sustainable future. There are a few main conclusions given in this enormous report, the Global Assessment on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, that appeared from IPBES 1 year ago. The first one, nature and its vital contributions to people, which together embody biodiversity and ecosystem functions and services, are deteriorating worldwide. And that is the picture I've given you just a glimpse of now for the species level. But it's the same story at the genetic level, the ecosystem level. IPBES also looked at the drivers and said that the direct and indirect drivers of change have accelerated during the past 50 years. So despite all the work in the world, these drivers are still accelerating. And there is a very important link between the indirect drivers and the direct drivers being described in the IPBES report. And as you can see, the indirect drivers, well, demographic and social cultural factors in society, economics, technology, of course, institutions and governance. That is the way we have organized our societies, the way we are living, the way we organize our economies. These are the indirect drivers behind the loss of biodiversity. But we often only focus on the direct drivers. That is why I showed you, for example, the land use change as a factor here and the direct overexploitation. These are the two most important ones. You can see there for terrestrial, freshwater, and marine environments, the relative importance of the different direct drivers. Climate change, the red one, is now appearing in third place, and it's increasing in importance, but still it's only in third place. It will change probably in the future. Next one, please. IPBES then also goes on to describe what are the consequences of this loss. And this is the way they summarize this. The goals for conserving and sustainably using nature and achieving sustainability cannot be met by current trajectories. So the Agenda 2030 is not being met, probably, because of the loss. IPBES did not make an evaluation of the goals in the agenda themselves, but they made an evaluation of the state of the biodiversity, the nature and nature's contributions that we need in order to be able to meet the goals, the Sustainable Development Goals. And you can see here in this table that this state of this biodiversity is poor declining for many of the most important SDGs. It's mixed for some of them, and for some we are lacking data. There should have been a column here with green dots as well, where we could say that we have the biodiversity safe and well functioning to be able to meet the SDGs, but we don't have that. We cannot say that for any of these. And this is really depressing. We're actually losing all the biodiversity we need to be able to meet Agenda 2030. And this table shows what is happening with the goals and targets of the Convention on Biological Diversity itself. And the conclusion here that we cannot reach the CBD IT targets. And you know, the IT targets, they are the 2020 targets. They were meant to be met this year. And as you can see in the progress for these 20 IT targets, it is rather poor. Many of them, especially those that should have addressed the drivers and the pressures on biodiversity and the status, they are red. They are really poor. Moderate success for some of them. And the green ones here, they are really interesting. There are a few, but they mainly concern action taken as, for example, writing a plan, adopting a strategy, but not really achieving any progress on the ground. So this is depressing. We have not met the 2020 targets for CBD. And if you look at the time line here, CBD was formed back in the early 1990s. And at COP6, we adopted the 2010 targets to be met by 2010. And then we adopted the 2020 targets, tighter targets, to be met by 2020. And still we have the observed trend of loss in biodiversity. And now we have the future. Where are we going? WWF says that now we need to bend the curve and to follow this dotted green line upwards instead of going further down. What do we need to be able to do that? Well, what we have done so far is obviously not enough. We have an enormous implementation deficiency. Despite all the work by the convention and other fora, we have simply not done enough. Now, CBD is negotiating a new strategy and new goals and targets for 2030 and 2050. Of course, because of the corona crisis, this process has been more or less postponed. We will not have the COP in October as planned. It will be probably in 1 year's time, in May 2021. Hope so. But this time, it is really important for the governments not only to come together to actually adopt very strong and ambitious goals and targets, but then also put all the efforts into actually achieving them. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Torbjörn, for that presentation. I will now try to link biodiversity even more to sustainable development. And then also I will shortly talk about the value of nature and financing of biodiversity. And then we will have a moderated discussion. And actually the bottom doesn't really work sometimes here in the computer when I try to. Mm-hmm. It's my computer. Let me see if I can. If I share it again, I will just try to see how to. Yes, now. So Torbjörn explained what biodiversity is. And I would like to also, and I have been asked to talk a little bit more about the concepts we use. And to start with, ecology actually comes from the Greek oikos, house, and logon, study, which is then the study of the house. And an ecosystem, it describes the web or network of relations among organisms at different scales. And so you can look upon living within the functions and the ability of the ecosystem to deliver ecosystem services, or what IPBES call nature's contribution to people. You can call that to being that you try to nourish the ecosystem in a way that we have a household insurance. And let me give you an example of this. Like if you have 10 doctors in a municipality and one doctor is sick, you still have 9 doctors to visit if you are sick. If you only have one doctor and that person would be sick, you might have to travel very far away if you want to have health care. And this kind of diversity, we say that it contributes to resilience. And then the resilience is the ability of a system to manage change, such as climate change and other changes, and then to continue to developing. And Torbjörn had talked about IPBES and the global assessment from last year. But to set the scene, also last year, we had the 2019 State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World that showcased that hunger is increasing again for the 4th year in a row. More than 820 people do not have enough to eat. In the same time last year, we had the Climate Change and Land report by IPCC and the Climate Change and Ocean and Cryosphere, the frozen environment reports. And if you look at the land report, and it showed that nearly 25% of the greenhouse gases comes from land use, such as agriculture and forestry. But then in the same time, these natural land processes absorb carbon dioxide, equivalent to almost a third of the carbon dioxide emissions. So therefore, you know, the conclusion is that managing land resources sustainably is one of many solutions. And it can be win-win solutions with food, climate, and biodiversity. Malin from the Agroforestry will give you one further example of that later on. And I'm sure Sarah from the Swedish Society for Nature Conservation will get into the discussions about the oceans and describe it better in a little bit of in a while. What we can see the latest 70 years is that we have had the socioeconomic trends like these hockey sticks, as Johan Rockström talks about, you know, with we have had the world population increasing, primary energy use increasing, etc. But then in the Earth system trends, you can see equally these kind of trends, for example, marine fish capture, terrestrial biosphere degradation, and so on. And one point here which is important to stress, that people living in poverty that might not have, I mean, they do depend on the local ecosystem to a larger extent than people who can go to a store and buy food from other parts of the world. And to describe how biodiversity is linked to agriculture, one example of this is that 75% of the world's food crops depend on pollinators. And according to IPBES, these pollinators are declining. More than 40% of pollinator species, particularly bees and butterflies, are facing extinction today. Another example of this is that also biodiversity is the foundation of food security in also the agricultural landscape, not just the sort of the species, you know. And this is, which of course is part of the landscape. But if you look at these kind of agroecological landscapes in comparison to intensive agriculture on the right hand and natural ecosystem on the left hand, this is a schematic picture, but these petals shows the different kinds of benefits of nature ecosystem services that the different landscapes produces for that we are dependent on. So for example, in an agroforestry landscape, in the middle one, you have crop production, timber production, natural pest control, air purification, pollination, and also habitats for biodiversity, which is very, very important. While in intensive agriculture, you might optimize for one crop. And then in the natural ecosystem, you might get less crops, of course, but it depends. You also live off different kinds of products from the natural ecosystem, of course. This is a very simplified picture. It's just to show what kind of benefits of nature you can get in the agriculture landscape that biodiversity contributes to. And then another example is how the contribution of biodiversity to the SDG 14, life below water. Over 3 billion people depend on marine and coastal biodiversity for their livelihood. And Sarah will talk about this further later on. And then in urban areas, sorry, I can see that the SDG 11 symbol here is flipping a little bit. It's in different languages. Sorry, I didn't see that, but can show the global aspects of this. So planning with biodiversity and ecosystem services in urban areas, it can increase resilience. What we see more and more in innovations in cities is that we can use vegetation to cool buildings, for example. We can see food production on rooftops. Wetlands contribute to both cleaning water and to the local biodiversity. Green areas contribute to health and recreation, and so on. And then on gender, as we all know, it's very important to do gender analysis when we work with development cooperation. And it's vital to reveal power relations, of course, and the different roles men and women have. And they also have different tasks, of course, and also might have different knowledge in relation to biodiversity. In many traditional cultures, women are the custodians of seeds. They know which seeds to store for next, collect and store for next year's crops, in terms of very many traditional crops that groups around the world use. And of course, many women might have different access to resources, and then of course, different access to financial services like microloans, etc. And this picture is a family from a work where the agroforestry is working in Kenya. It's Mr. and Mr. Nyaranga. They show a household roadmap that they have worked on together to plan the agriculture landscape they work with the agroforestry farm. In terms of inequality and justice, in development intervention, it's of course important to do an analysis of who benefits from ecosystems and interventions that do disturb the system as such as well, and also who bears then the negative impact of development interventions. And the lady here to the left is Berta Cáceres. She was General Director of the Effect Partner Organization COPIN, an indigenous peoples and peasant organization in Honduras, that were fighting for environmental indigenous people's rights in relation to hydroelectric power dams. And she was murdered in 2016. Many of my former colleagues at We Effect know Berta. In 2019, about 120 environment and human rights defenders lost their lives, what we know of, when they were fighting for the rights of the people they were working for. The middle picture shows corn from Mexico. And the right to seed is fundamental right for smallholder farmers. Without seeds, there is no agriculture, and access to seeds and ability to not only choose them, but also to produce, store, use, exchange, and sell them is crucial for smallholder farmers. And these rights are threatened by agreements related to intellectual property rights today. And on the right-hand picture here, it's a handbook that Swedish Bio have produced on human rights to a healthy environment for thriving earth. It's a lot of these kinds of publications that you also can read after this conversation. To sum up this section, you can see that the biosphere SDGs on the SDG 15 and 14 and SDG 6 and 13 sort of upholds the other SDGs. It's the basis for development. And also that biodiversity then contributes to achieving all of the SDGs. I will shortly now talk a little bit about the value of nature and financing of biodiversity. And the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report from 2020, it showed that biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse is ranked as one of the top 5 threats to humanity the coming 10 years. And it's valued that half the world's total GDP is highly dependent, moderate or highly dependent on nature and the services. So nature loss matters for most businesses. I wanted to highlight this because this is communicated in the Forum of World Economic Forum and has then reached a lot of business leaders around the world. But then the value of nature, it's not just about a price, it's much wider than that. And the work under IPBES, the work stream on values shows also the multiple other values between humans and nature. such as health and well-being in general. And in Sweden, we did this, it was a government official report produced 2013 that looked into these kind of values. And one way of valuing it is the nature for humans, and to actually use that as a tool in development collaborations as well, is to identify the benefits of nature or the ecosystem services, whatever you would like to call it, and the users. So if you know what benefits are out there and who uses it, you can start to have a dialogue around that and actually see who will bear the negative burdens and so on, and positive, of course. On financing, under the Convention on Biodiversity, which you will hear more about tomorrow, it's in Article 20, it's actually stated that the developed country parties shall provide new and additional financial resources to enable developing country parties to meet the agreed full incremental cost to them of implementing measures which fulfill the obligations of the Convention. And this is in terms of both overseas development collaboration and innovative funding. And another work stream deals with biodiversity and poverty alleviation under the Convention. But on this kind of financing mechanism, it could be what people call payment for ecosystem services or biodiversity offsets and so on, but also actually fiscal reforms, putting the subsidies right, like taxes and subsidies and so on. When we work with this, it's of course again important to have safeguards in place for people's rights and access to resources and livelihoods. Under the CBD, voluntary guidelines on this have been produced that I also can send links to if anyone is interested. And the state has one role to set the rules for businesses and so on to act. But then we have the banks, investment companies, the financial players in general, that influence climate stability and ecosystem health. And, through ownership of stocks and so on. And it's of course important to acknowledge that these players are huge and important to both influence, to not fund what Greta talked about in the movie we saw in the beginning, the destruction of nature, but that they fund programs, projects, and so on that are in favor of nature and people. Sleeping Financial Giants is a report that Stockholm Resilience Center released last year. It's quite interesting. It's also an interesting film connected to this. So, biodiversity is development. I think that is what we can conclude, at least I think in the mind of me and Torbjörn and others. And it's important to stress that what we lose when we lose biodiversity and the knowledge related to it is diminishing capacity for innovation and development. And innovation can be new innovations like this urban landscape, but also old innovations like these ancient terrace systems that we see in one of the pictures. And I think that this is important to have in mind when we work with organizations we work with. And it would be interesting to hear more about how you see your role in the organizations you work with, on how it can contribute to both nature and people in this context. I end there. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Marie and Torbjörn, for this very thorough and interesting overview of some of the main issues. We now have about 15 minutes left for questions and discussions, and I would encourage everyone who's participating to enter remind you to enter your questions or comments in the chat. I've seen we have Jenny also who is monitoring the chat, so she will be picking up questions that come in. I've only seen one so far, so I'll take that immediately because there's no need to select from one. and that is about the new biodiversity strategy that the EU presented last week. The question is, do you have any, what's your assessment, preliminary assessment of this proposal that came? Is it good, or is it inadequate, or any views, quick views? I mean, it was only a few days ago, wasn't it? So, would anyone want to comment? Torbjörn?
Well, I can just say a few words. I haven't done. You really need to look into a document like this, because the devil is in the details here. It's easy to look at the headlines. For example, take this 30% protected areas in sea areas and land areas. What does that really mean? What do you mean when you say protected? What kind of activities would be allowed in an area like that? It could be something that really is supporting sustainable use and development. It could also be something that will be very much seen as hindering development, depending on who you are and what kind of activities you are involved in. So we actually need to look very closely at the mechanisms that would be behind achieving that kind of goal, to be able to say whether it's good or bad for the biodiversity and sustainable development. But of course, it is really positive that the Commission now is addressing the issue on biodiversity itself, because, well, for a long time, biodiversity has taken second place to climate. Now we have the coronavirus, so we have slipped down to third place probably. And now in this period that the Commission has taken the time to address this, I think it's really encouraging. Also, as shown by the video with Greta, there is a growing realization that you cannot actually select to work only on climate. You need always to combine it with other work on biodiversity. So I think the Commission is stepping in the right direction here. Then it of course also remains to be seen what the member states will be doing with this and what the Parliament will be doing with this strategy.
I can maybe add here, I think that it's also important to say that the same day...
There's some problem with your mic. It's very noisy. Try again.
Do you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
So I just wanted to add that the same day, you know, it was also the farm to fork strategy that was announced, and with targets on organic farming and so on. And I think that one is also very important to analyze, you know, because to see how that can contribute to both biodiversity and people. I would actually not go into further details. I've been starting to read the documents, but I need a little bit more time actually.
One question that links to what Torbjörn said, if you look outside of Europe also, I mean, the issue of, you know, who defends nature and how is a big issue, and there's a tendency to look at, you know, the formally protected areas and so on. Could you say something more, because that's also been raised very much in the IPBES reports on the role of traditional management and tenure of land and resources, and the role that local communities and indigenous peoples have played and continue to play in preserving and also sustainably managing and using nature.
Yeah, well, there is a finding in the IPBES report that a large proportion of the remaining, not perhaps intact, but relatively well functioning ecosystems are found in areas that are being used by or owned by local communities and indigenous peoples around the world. The mechanism behind that is harder to see actually, and it's probably not one single explanation. It's important to remember that these communities, they are diverse and they are rapidly evolving in many cases as well. And the patterns we now see in biodiversity are not necessarily the effect of the factors that work now. There may be time lapse in this so that we see the result of previous land use, for example. And it would be very interesting to look into this further to see what are actually the mechanisms behind the relatively more well-functioning biodiversity and ecosystem functions in these areas as a result of the kind of land use being done by indigenous peoples and local communities.
Yes, thank you. Jenny, have you picked up any further questions?
Yeah, we have a question. First, thank you for a great presentation. And it would also be great if Torbjörn and Maria wants to share the presentation with us afterwards. So we can share that with the attendees. And then we have a question around the COVID-19 and how will that affect the loss of biodiversity?
Well, as said in introduction to today's seminar, there is a lot going on now, which is, well, it's not being covered well by the government agencies, and look at natural parks and protected areas in Africa, where guards now have much less possibilities to actually cover the area and see what's going on. So we fear that there is a greater loss in protected areas right now. Then there is also a discussion on the connection here between biodiversity itself and viruses and other kinds of organisms that spread diseases. This is not the first time that a virus has transmitted from a wild mammal to human beings. It's happened before, and the effect we often see is that people then draw the conclusion that then, of course, we must exterminate that kind of animal that transmits the disease. So there could actually be misguided, misdirected kind of process that is directed against the wild populations of mammals that people see then as the source of a disease like this, when in fact it is actually the uncontrolled overexploitation of wild mammals that is a factor in the spread of this disease. So it is the human behavior, not the animal population, that is actually the source.
I can add here, if it's fine. I mean, I think now when we open up society again, and with all the economic sort of stimuli packages and so on, that we really need to think about not just bouncing back, it's like bouncing forward. Of course, I do understand very much that we need to invest in better sort of health care. We have seen that in Sweden. And so on, and that sort of it's some primary things we need to do first. But when we look about sort of economic instrument, you know, like subsidies, taxes, and so on, it's a lot of things we can do to invest in transforming the way we actually work with the ecosystem in the productive sectors like fisheries, agriculture, and so on. And I think we really need to put an effort in helping out here to think about how we can contribute as different organizations in influencing our politicians and so on in this, and also how we perform ourselves in relation to development collaborations and programs that we fund. So it really is something that is resilient for the future. It's there. I mean, really, we have an opportunity here to work with a transformation that is needed. And then, of course, then we have to have this kind of discussion, you know, what is prosperity? What is really social ecological prosperity in a deeper sense? What kind of relationship do we want to have in between nature and humans, and between humans and humans? I think this is conversations we need to have.
Perfect. We have another question here as well. The failure of the 2011 to 2020 biodiversity decade is pretty staggering. What do we as CSO and activists need to do differently to ensure we do not repeat the same mistakes?
Shall you go, Torbjörn, or do you want me to?
You can start.
I mean, the implementation gap is huge, and that is quite frustrating. I have been working with the Convention on Biodiversity for a long time, together with Torbjörn and others. And, you know, it's like now we start to negotiate the same decisions again, you know, that we already have in place if you look back in the Convention's history. So it's important, you know, that these kind of seemingly political activities don't stop with the text. It has to get implemented. And, you know, as civil society, we have two roles. We are both like watchdogs, and we work with programs, we fund programs, we work with people. And in these two roles, we need to step up, I think, and really question, you know, what's going on, and really also contribute with solutions. I mean, we have excellent solutions to showcase, like, for example, at the agroforestry, it's fantastic, I mean, pictures of solutions that we can offer, and at WWF and Swedish Society for Nature Conservation, many of us. So it's, I think we really need to be more focused, more targeted, work together to both influence policy and implementation. Because this implementation gap, it's terrible and huge.
And there's a term being used now, transformative change. What does that really mean? IPBES is using that term to describe what is needed now. It's not simply implementing better and more the same kind of measures. We need different kind of thinking, different kind of activities to be able to reach the goals. I've been looking now into the proposals for goals and targets in the new framework for the post-2020 framework, CBD, and I see there is a change here in the way things are formulated. In the 2020 targets, 30 targets, they were about protecting, using sustainable, and always finding a sustainable development that would protect biodiversity. It goes through all the goals and targets. Now there is a large set of targets in the new discussion that actually says that biodiversity must provide. It must provide for the growing number of people on Earth. And that is a new factor we didn't have in the previous set of goals and targets. So the demand on biodiversity now from the parties of CBD is actually increasing. That is both worrying and encouraging, because the first thing is that people now actually see that this is an important resource that we need to be able to use to be able to feed all people. At the same time, it opens up possibility that we actually focus less on the sustainable part of it and much more on the production of more resources for human beings. We need actually to balance this even better than we've done before. It's not just about feeding people and protecting. We need to find a way of doing it both at the same time.
I just put the definition from the IPBES on transformative change in the chat. I'm part of a group under IPBES working on the scoping of an assessment of transformative change. But the definition is a fundamental system-wide reorganization across technological, economic, and social factors, including paradigms, goals, and values. And I think we really need to work on our values.
Okay, there's a lot of questions in the chat also on strategies and how to influence the CBD and how to influence other actors, the private sector, businesses, and so on. And of course, much of this will be covered in the discussions, both by examples in our next session, but primarily also tomorrow when we focus more on the different institutions and platforms and so on for the strategies. So we're almost running up to our closing time. I want to ask Jenny, is there any particular question that you picked up for the last short round?
Perhaps you can answer on the main conflicts between poverty and biodiversity. Are there any main conflicts, or can we work with them together?
Well, that was an easy one.
Do you want me, Torbjörn, to?
Oh, you can start if you like.
I mean, that is, it depends, again, you know, because, I mean, to start with, what is poverty? I mean, this is a huge discussion. Multidimensional poverty, you know, it's not just money, it's a lot of things that, that is in the concept of multidimensional poverty. And then people who are considered to be poor, so to speak, economic poor, might be that for a reason, you know, that they might have had other drivers in society that have deprived them from their resources that they live off. That would then be a connection where they don't have livelihood from biodiversity because it's gone for some external reason that they might not have influenced at all. But then again, you know, to work with the ecosystem in a sustainable and resilient way, like for example, again, you know, the example of the agroforestry. Here you can see how poverty elevation, caring for the ecosystem, it goes hand in hand. You know, you can have an extremely productive agroforestry system, which actually do deliver also economic growth. So the answer is very complex. And I hope that you, in these 2 days, will explore this further. I think I stopped there due to time. I could talk a long time about this subject, but it's very, very important question, and I hope you will be discussing it further. And please get back to me if you would like to talk about it further.
I can add that the resources needed from biodiversity and ecosystems for reducing or eliminating poverty, they are there. It would be no problem to use all the resources needed for actually getting rid of all poverty in the world. But if you look at where the resources go now from using biodiversity and ecosystems, it's not to that. It's not for eliminating poverty. It is for feeding the already rich. And that is the main problem here, that we are allocating resources in the wrong way. When we are saying that we need to reduce our consumption, we are not talking about all people in the world. There are many people that need to actually increase their consumption, and others like us that must then reduce our to give room for that increase among the poor.
Okay, thank you very much. We need to stop there in order to get a little bit of time for a break for our next session. Thank you very much, Marie and Torbjörn, for your contributions.
Thank you.
And you're of course welcome to log out and log in as participants for the remaining 2 days, if you have the time. And we will now break for 12 minutes until 10:30. And the new faces that you see coming up on the screen are some of the participants for our next session, where we will look more into the experiences of some of our own organizations, civil society organizations, of addressing these issues in real life. So we break here for 12 minutes, and please everybody be back at 10:30. We'll start at 10:30 sharp. Okay? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Göran. Thank you, Torbjörn. Thank you.
Hi, can you, hello, good morning. This will stop screen share.
Yep.
Okay. We will start in 5 minutes. Please,
Okay.
Please be aware that you are in picture and for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks.
All right, everyone. It's 10:30 and we're ready to start the next session. I will very briefly, shortly hand over to Gloria Jimwaga, who's the Land and Food and Land Rights Advisor at Africa Göppena, who will be facilitating this session. Before I do so, I just want to remind you, all participants, that you can ask questions in the chat and that they will be picked up for the discussion after the initial presentation. So without further ado, over to Gloria, who will facilitate the next hour.
Thank you very much. Welcome everyone to the second session of the day. And I will go into a little bit about the work that I do later on after the presentation. So in this session, we will have 1 hour and we will go to the experience of civil societies. within Sweden and how we all work with biodiversity in different countries. So in this, we will get to hear different methodologies that we use and also our partners' countries, what they do. And in this, we will show the linkage between land rights, food sovereignty, ocean, climate change, and gender equality. For today, we have 3 presentations. And the first presentation will be from Sam Munich. He's a program officer for the 10-year facility, and he works directly with indigenous people, local communities to ensure land and forest rights. Sam also belongs to the Karen indigenous people of Burma. You will hear more about that from him. Also, the other presentation will be from Marlene Gustafsson. She is the coordinator for Agroforestry Network, or the Agroforestry, a Swedish organization that works against fight of poverty and food insecurity. It's also a platform for agroforestry practice, and with their work, they promote agroforestry in developing countries. And lastly, we will have Sarah Frocklin. She's the Senior Policy Advisor for the Swedish Society of Nature Conservation and works with international ocean and fisheries. So we will tap into the blue. And also she will present an address on the marine biodiversity and human rights. Since our time is very limited, the presenters will have a specific time, and afterwards we will have a discussion, the last 25 minutes, and we will have a chance to tap into more details of what is discussed. So please feel free to ask questions of all the presentation, and we will get back to that. Okay, Sam, it's on to you.
Wow, thank you so much. What a great honor to be speaking to you all. Could you hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Yes, okay, very good. Thanks a lot. Let me start by sharing my screen. Is the screen sharing okay from the side?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This morning we heard already about the interaction and the importance of biodiversity, and then what are the challenges ahead with us, especially with the COVID-19. But today I will specifically focus on land and forest rights for indigenous people and local community, and their potential contribution. They have already contributed to the biodiversity and our forest governance. First of all, let me take you to a little journey to, it's a small indigenous community village. It's called Kasapu and Karan. And this is about 120 kilometers southwest of Jakarta. So I took this picture on our road up to the mountain. And the signs say that the forest is no longer a state forest. What happened was the local community, local parliament had passed a local regulation to recognize indigenous forests. So in 2016, December, community were handed back the forest to them by the local government. So as a result of that, community were able to thrive their traditional customary collective land rights, able to grow fruits, and also they even started this small ecotourism project, which is very, very beautiful. And this young man is studying the the vocational training. He's taking a break from study and leading the local development project, which is very inspiring. This is an example of the securing land rights for indigenous people and local community can contribute to our important burning issue about sustainable development, poverty, ecosystem management, better forest governance, and many other things. I would today mainly focus on indigenous people and local community. I will be using the term IPLC repeatedly, but they are the key stakeholder for climate solution. Indigenous people own 35% of the world lands. And if we include the local community, that will be about 50%. The government legally recognized their ownership to only 10%. So we still have a lot of work to do. And another important aspect is that indigenous people land 35% intersect with protected area of the world. This is very important because all the investment, all the attention that we put into the protected area without regard or without considering the right of indigenous people, their free, prior, informed consent right. And that could potentially create unintended consequences. And securing indigenous people and local community land rights will benefit them by providing a foundation for achieving sustainable development, and climate stability, reduce conflict, poverty reduction, and human dignity. This is very important. I can go into many different details, but the fundamental value here is that indigenous people and their relation to their land is their identity. We cannot take away from that. So giving them their fundamental rights, access, management rights to their forests, and that will follow up with like sustainable development, reduction in conflicts, and that will go to and also reduce the poverty, and then they can live as a human dignity. So important, really important to talk about the biodiversity, and then it's also we need to have another discussion, not independently of ecological diversity, that include indigenous people, local community, and indigenous held forests are associated with low rate of deforestation and high rate for carbon and biodiversity. It's not to say that there is no forest deforestation going on in indigenous territory. It is, but indigenous people were not destroying for sure that the entire forest. Nature is a part of their identity. Nature is a given to them. So there will be a logging, a sustainable logging, and consistent with the balance of nature. Indigenous forest area also has a low risk for investment. Securing land right were protected, which also protect the investment. And the stronger the right, the stronger the protection for indigenous people, local community, and particularly for women, youth, and children, who are the most vulnerable sector of society. This is the study, a preparation for COP 2015, COP 21, December 2015. So the data is a little bit outdated, but it's still very relevant. The study is for 4 regions. It's Mesoamerica, Amazonia, and DRC Congo, and Indonesia. So, so the total carbon is still above ground. 20% of them are still indigenous territory. Now let me go into a little bit in Indonesia. So the indigenous territory is not legally recognized. So there's a potential danger that about 24.8 gigatons of carbon dioxide could be released into the atmosphere, and if the rights are not fully and legally recognized. And we know that there is a discussion and a lot of support has been going on about securing indigenous people local land rights by medias and by activists, including the popes and many major donors. Thankful to our donor as well. However, securing land right will not automatically lead to reducing deforestation or better forest governance if efforts are not sustained by complementary actions, such as a reformed legal and policy framework and a well-functioning institution. This is the area where we need to focus on very much. And integrate the land use planning whereas we should act together as a group, not individually, and also their rights of free, primary, informed consent. And very important things are the capacity development, including the indigenous community and also the government officer. And finally, we heard this morning already, funding to fund the right investment. So maybe this is the right time to fund indigenous people and local community directly.
Sorry to interrupt, you have 1 minute.
Yeah, thank you so much. And let me share my final thought with, this is Gerald Wahid. He is the head of the community that I was referring to earlier. He shared me a story that I will remember for the rest of my life. This is a lesson learned from another indigenous person. He told me people come to my territory for clean and fresh air. And they also want to teach me the concept of sustainability. So instead of supporting what we already done very well, they're trying to teach him or force him a new idea that may not consistently, in line with their philosophy, their culture, their ideology, their value, and their practices. So I think it's really time for us right now to study and understand the indigenous knowledge, their culture, their customary system, and appreciate them, respect them, and recognize and also promote them. And that is the thing that I think I would take for myself, and I want to share with you. And thanks for listening. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, Sam. And I think we will have more time in this question and answer to just go more into detail. It's really interesting. For the second one, Merlin, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Gloria. Let's see if I can share my screen.
The rest, we could switch off our mics while Merlin is getting ready.
See now my presentation?
No, we don't see it.
Oh. Okay. Now maybe.
Yes, perfect. Just needs to be in full screen, then it's good to go. Perfect.
Yeah. I will talk about biodiversity in agriculture, and I will do that with the help of a management practice that has received a lot of attention for its many ecological as well as social benefits, and that is agroforestry, which means integrating trees in agriculture. And agroforestry really requires all forms of biodiversity, as illustrated here, by including trees in agriculture, in, for example, crop production and/or in animal husbandry. Smallholder farmers in developing countries can increase biodiversity and support many ecosystem services. For example, trees, they provide food and medicine, and firewood, which many need to cook their food. The leaves on the trees, they fall down to the ground and decompose, and that helps support the soil fertility. And the tree roots also protect against soil erosion. And they help water penetrate the soil surface so that the water can go into the soil, supporting the water cycle. And trees also provide shade for the crops, as well as for both livestock and people. Okay, let me introduce Margaret Mushanga. She is a Kenyan farmer who has transformed her farm with agroforestry. If I can start the film.
Nowadays, I feel more resilient about the climate change. because I've planted the trees on the land. When it gets dry, I can take the branches, the leaves from the branches and feed my cattle. Those trees do make my soil to be moist. They keep shade on my crops. They don't dry up. So I feel good. I feel resilient. That's an obvious thing. We need trees. If we don't have trees, we will starve. We will starve because our soil will get spoiled. It will dry up. Our cows will not have food. Ourselves, food will not be there because the soil will not be fertile, will not have enough rain, and also the circulation of oxygen will not be there because when it goes on the ground, it recycles the nutrients.
Can you still hear me?
Yes, I think if you mute.
Something happened with the film. I will just start it again.
Okay, and if you mute your speaker while the video plays, then we could hear it.
Okay, should I start over with the film?
I think you can continue just where it ended.
Oh, sorry, okay.
The nutrients. Good to be having the trees on the land. I used to take my cows for free range, walking long distance. My cows were getting tired. I was also getting tired. I wasn't happy. My cows were also not happy. But today, because I keep my cows in my home, I feed from my home, from the trees that I have planted. Now I collect just from within to use for my biogas. Where after cooking, also I get manure. And the milk now is improved. It is enough for my children. I take some to the cooperative where I earn at the end of the month. I'm dreaming of planting 500 trees on my land because of the future of my children. And I feel that all of us should be part of saving the climate. Nowadays, I can live on what I produce from my farm. I can sell crops like bananas, vegetables, and also milk for my cattle. I can pay for my health insurance. I'm able to pay school fees for my children. I can cater for my domestic use. I can buy clothes for my family, and I have enough food for my family. Happy farmer.
Yes, thank you, Margaret. Sorry for the technical problems. I need to mute and managed to keep instead. Here now. So what Margaret is experiencing, and also what Maria Schultz was talking about in her presentation before, is the differences between management practices. A conventional farm, it's the red flower here, it often puts all efforts on crop production, using only one or a few species, and that leads to loss of biodiversity as well as ecosystem services. An agroforestry farm, the blue flower here, it can have high productivity while also supporting both biodiversity and ecosystem services. There are also many social benefits. For example, agroforestry can contribute to higher yields as well as more diverse food production. This means that there is less reliance on one crop and less risk of food insecurity if that one crop would fail. Also, the fruits and nuts from the trees are rich in nutrients and minerals and can support nutritional security. Agroforestry can give a multitude of ways to earn an income for smallholder farmers. Take Margaret, for example. She's selling bananas, vegetables, and milk from her cows. Agroforestry can also free up time and provide many opportunities for women's empowerment. As an example, when you have access to both firewood and fodder for your animals on the farm, you don't have to walk long distances to find it, which traditionally is a job for women and maybe children. This increased personal safety, and it provides more time for school and income generating activities. Nancy and Domitilia in the photo here, they are members of a farmers cooperative that have been trained in agroforestry by Viskogen, the agroforestry. But let's look more into the economic opportunities. Like Margaret showed us, agroforestry enables farmers to generate a diversified income. One farm can produce mango, coffee, macadamia nuts, timber, honey, beans, and fodder for the cattle. But, big but, agroforestry value chains and market systems really need to be further developed. And we can support this by linking farmers to markets. This means that we need to establish fair market connections for local and regional markets, but also to export markets for top quality or niche products like, for example, baobab that you can buy here in Sweden. We also need systems for traceable and trustworthy products. And it is often of great value for smallholder farmers to be part of a farmer organization.
Merlin, you have 1 minute left.
Thank you. Yes, so if you would like to know more about this, then Agroforestry Network that I'm coordinating, we have just released 2 new policy briefs, one on biodiversity and ecosystem services and one on value chains and market systems. And you can find them on both the Viskogen and Agroforestry Network websites. That's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Marlin. Thank you for your presentation. So we will go to the last presentation, and it's from Sarah. And due to technical difficulties, we are going to share her video that she recorded earlier, but she will be present to answer the question. So I will try to share the video. Can everybody see the video? Yes? Okay.
Yes.
I will mute and then play the video. If you do hear it, please nod.
We do not hear the sound, Gloria.
I cannot hear the sound.
I will try again.
The oceans produce 50% of the oxygen.
Can you hear it?
And absorb up to
So
30%.
I will start again.
Yes, we hear it.
Thank you, and hi everyone. So now it's time to enter the blue part of our planet. And the oceans are commonly referred to as the heart of planet Earth. And the reason why it's called the blue planet is because water covers 70% of our planet. The oceans produce 50% of the oxygen we breathe and absorb up to 30% of the atmospheric carbon dioxide. So the oceans are very important in mitigating climate change. The oceans are also home for between 500,000 and 10 million species. And about 40% of the world's population live within 100 kilometers of the coast. And this is the setting in which we typically work. And this is a coastal seascape consisting of very biodiverse and interconnected ecosystems, from coastal forest on land to the deep sea. And just to give you an example, Coral reefs alone hold 25% of the marine biodiversity. These ecosystems also contribute numerous benefits to people, such as coastal protection, essential food and medicine sources, and many different cultural and aesthetic values. This is also the place where traditional livelihoods, such as, for example, shellfish collection and small-scale fisheries take place. But we have mistreated our oceans for a long time, and 66% of marine areas are severely altered by human actions. And the main drivers for biodiversity loss in the oceans are unsustainable fishing, land and sea use change, climate change, and pollution. So the coastal ecosystems are lost at an alarming rate, and this have major effects on biodiversity. And about 90% of the world's commercial fish stocks are fully fished or overexploited. And this biodiversity loss have negative impacts on human rights. Evictions from land, conflicts over resources, and forced labor in the fisheries sector are becoming more and more common features. So to address some of these issues, we work for fair, sustainable, and transparent fisheries policy. And we specifically advocate for the preferential access of sustainable small-scale fisheries to traditional fishing grounds and resources. We also work for the sustainable use and improved governance of marine resources. And it's specifically important to recognize tenure and the role of small-scale fishing communities and indigenous peoples in restoring, conserving, and managing marine biodiversity. And here we advocate for more and legally recognized community conserved areas. And we do this by supporting and cooperating with partner organizations in Latin America, Africa, and Asia through mobilizing knowledge exchange, capacity building, and by engaging in joint advocacy work on both national, EU, and international level. So why do we focus on small-scale fisheries? Well, first of all, fisheries is a #1 marine sector. It's actually larger than all other marine sectors combined. And within the fishery sector, 90% of all fish workers are actually traditional and small scale. So small scale fisheries involve over 800 million people directly. And it's also vital for food and income for billions of people, especially in low-income countries. And small scale fisheries are often less harmful, meaning that they are associated with low impact gear and low bycatch. Despite their importance, small-scale fisheries are often missing in statistics and in policy, and this is particularly true for women's work. There is also a general lack of markets and bargaining power. So this means that already marginalized fishing communities are at a losing end, with increased poverty, food security, and poor health as a consequence. So to illustrate how this plays out on the ground, I would like to read a quote from a woman fish trader in Senegal, a country in which we work. Our waters are transforming into a desert. How can the state sell out our resources to foreign fishing fleets and fish meal factories when it is not enough fish for us to make a living and provide food to our families? We, the women, are the ones that put food on the table. We pay for healthcare and education of our children. When there is no fish, it affects directly our living conditions. And here is another quote from a fishery in South Africa. And it illustrates how small-scale fisheries is traditionally discriminated in policy. During apartheid, they took our land, our homes, and our rights. 90% of South Africa's small-scale fishing families were left with no fishing rights. And we are still struggling to get them back, but the state is more in favor of privatizing the sea and improve the GDP than supporting our sustainable small-scale activities. However, in 2014, and after years and years of consultations, the FAO finally adopted the voluntary guidelines for securing sustainable small-scale fisheries. And these guidelines were signed by 120 states. The process leading up to their adoption was participatory and included 4,000 actors, including CSOs, NGOs, academics, decision makers, and we actually took part in this process too. The guidelines are holistic and builds on all the 3 dimensions of sustainable development. They further build on the principles of human rights and gender equality and non-discrimination. And we see these guidelines as a very important tool to enhance biodiversity, to end poverty, to eliminate hunger, and to ensure that human rights are mainstreamed in environmental policy. They are actually important to achieve many of the SDGs. But despite being adopted back in 2014, they are far from implemented. So our main focus right now is on their implementation in national, that is in partner countries, on EU level, and in international environmental and fisheries policy. So when it comes to conservation, there is no doubt that the oceans need stronger protection from harmful activities. There are also international goals, both within the CBD and within the SDGs, of 10% protected oceans in 2020. A popular strategy to protect the oceans are in the form of state-governed marine protected areas. But over the years, MPAs have been criticized for their failure to recognize social dimensions and human rights. And this has resulted in a lack of involvement of IPLCs, limited information, and low compliance. And this quote from a community member in Kenya actually illustrates that. Environmental management is like a war zone. There is no democracy, and we, the coastal communities, are not invited to take part in biodiversity conservation, such as the marine protected areas, although we have good knowledge from centuries of protecting our environment. Instead, restrictions are imposed and our livelihoods threatened. So just to sum it up, marine biodiversity is lost at an alarming rate, and the main drivers for this loss are overfishing and land and sea use change. Securing marine biodiversity is fundamental for food security, poverty eradication, and climate change mitigation, and actually to fulfill many of the SDGs. And tenure and fishing rights are central to realize many human rights, such as the right to food, nutrition, decent work, and health, and they must therefore be secured, not violated. Small-scale fishing communities' lived knowledge, tradition, and needs must be better included in biodiversity conservation. And here we see the SSF guidelines as an important tool, as it offers a solution for both environmental, economic, and social issues. So thank you. So thank you, and hi everyone. So now it's...
Okay, I hope I stopped sharing the screen. Yes, can everybody hear me? Okay, thank you very much for all the 3 presentations. I know we don't have so much time, so it's really hard to get into details of this. I'd just like to sum it up a little bit. I will talk about on my area. So as introduced before, I work with Afrikagrupperna here in Sweden. We also have an office in South Africa, and I'm the policy advisor for food and land rights. And what was really interesting throughout the whole discussion is the whole concept of the strength of women and women control to resources, to natural resources like land, and the different challenges that women face. And this is something that we also in Afrikagrupperna, we work with. And on the path of showing the importance of small-scale farmers in terms of protection of seeds and their biodiversity. So we really advocate a lot on food sovereignty. And even in the early morning discussion, we discussed a little bit about the importance of local seed varieties and how communities share and save seeds. And this is really important. But this was also reflected in Sam's presentation when he talked about the protection of indigenous communities and their ownership of their resources. And what was really interesting about all the three presentations is that it all in one way or the other talked about the producers themselves, small-scale farmers, small-scale fisheries, and also the indigenous community, that they are dependent on the biodiversity, but not just because of their livelihood, but also because it's connected to identity and survival of communities. And I can see that we all have a very connection with the climate change. In one way or another, our different civil society works towards either preventing the causes of climate change, but also the mitigation process, where you have protection of water bodies, but also protection of indigenous rights in terms of forestry and their ownership of land. The other aspect that I also thought that was really interesting is the talk about exploitation of different natural resources, whether it's land, water, or forestry. And all it comes back to the commodification of these natural resources. We have commodification of seeds, where we have a lot of push towards hybrids and GMO and neglecting the indigenous communities' experience on indigenous seed, such as one of our partners in Mozambique, UNAC. But we also, throughout the presentation, talked about the importance of local knowledge and that it needs to be listened, protected. And this can be done through different tools that we have. We have different declaration in terms of the indigenous communities, but also we have in terms of water bodies and protection, and also like the UN declaration. In this process, what the corona situation has shown is that the human right violation continues to exist, and it's even more during disasters and pandemics. And we have seen communities like farmers being pushed aside when they want to sell their products. But example in India, but also in South Africa, and fisheries complaining that they can't fish, but still big companies are given the space. So we see that in this process, there's a lot of that. Now, so we can dive into a little bit about the questions that we have. So let's see. One of the questions to all the participants, and I think maybe we could start with a quick contribution from Sam, is that what are the top 3 policy change that you would like to see? And how do we involve grassroots in advocacy work towards policy and decision making? This is a very big question, but maybe you could tap into just one of the policy areas.
Well, thank you very much. I think it's a very, very relevant question. It's very difficult to quantify with like the top 3 or top 2 or top 1. But I think the fundamental issue is the rights, securing land and forest rights of indigenous people and local community. That protection is given by the law, and then we also need to have a important institution that really functioning, is robust, and also can actually can act in real time, so that any process in coordination with the government, and so it shouldn't take like a year or 2 or 3. It had to be like in real time. So capacity building for the community, capacity building for institution that we think that can actually translate this policy framework into real life. And also, what's very important to think about is that indigenous people in our community, they already have the customary land tenure system. And this system needs to be well more explored and also recognized. Their knowledge, tradition, culture need to be respected and recognized, and also need to be funded. They need access for finance. So yeah, I think that would be my conclusion at this point.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Sam. I think you pointed out very important aspect of recognition, because you have different policies that are in play, but then when it comes to implementation, it's very difficult because sometimes in different countries, there's no recognition of such right, especially when it comes to customary ownership, which is given more like a very low status compared to having a title and statutory ownership. But we can dive that into more a little bit later. But now I would like to ask Merlin, what do you think is the biggest challenge when it comes to agroforestry, especially towards a gender perspective? Because we have, you showed us a video of a woman who's showing that she's really engaged and really thinks it's beneficial for her. But what are the challenges in a very gender perspective, not just in Kenya, but also globally when we deal with agroforestry?
I think it's true for many parts of the world that women, their knowledge is rarely recognized in decision making, and also that they are often disadvantaged compared to men when it comes to access to and control of finance and resources, land rights, and so on. And that's also true for trees and the products that come from trees. So it's important to recognize that women have specialized knowledge, and also that they have to promote their rights.
Could everybody turn off their mic, please, except for Merlin?
Yeah, and it's been shown in studies that it's different priorities. Women tend to prioritize family needs when they are engaging in agroforestry practices, while men are often investing in agroforestry for more commercial reasons. And this also brings different kind of knowledge when they work with agroforestry. And I think that's why many women have more knowledge in species diversity and management, for example, which is important for biodiversity and ecosystem services.
Yes, thank you, Merlin. Just tapping into the same kind of question towards Sarah, but towards ocean and waters. I saw that in your presentation you had a chat on showing how the gender roles in different aspects in the territorials, and as it goes deeper, the less women it is. So how does this contribute to a reflection of different policies and what is seen relevant in protecting the oceans, especially if it's a little bit far away from what you see?
I'm sorry, Margaret. Did you ask about gender or about
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes.
Yes. I'm sorry, Margaret. I didn't get the question. Did you ask about gender in the seascape, or was it more related to policies?
More a gender-related policy, so it's interconnected. So you
yeah. Okay, so that figure I show is actually from my thesis I wrote on gender issues in Tanzania, and it clearly showed that the women and the men have completely different access to the seascape, which is, I mean, very much related to the access to technique, but also the fact that women are mainly responsible for household duties and childcare. And within that work, we also targeted managers and decision makers. And it was so clear that within the policies, they were completely gender insensitive, and none of the work that women did was actually included in the formal environmental policies. Some people we talked to even said that, you know, why should we include what women do, like collecting shellfish? Because they just do it for fun. It doesn't have an effect on the environment, and it doesn't contribute, you know, to enough to be part of the policy. But as I mentioned, the small-scale fisheries guidelines, I think, is a very important tool to, because they build on gender, and they actually capture the whole value chains. So women's activities within pre-harvesting, post-harvesting, trade, all those activities are included in the guidelines. So by implementing them in national fisheries policy, you will kind of, it's a very, very good first step to deal with some of these issues.
Thank you, Sarah. We have different initiatives and different declaration that have been signed in the globe, and one of them is the UN Declaration for Peasants' Rights. And we know that Sweden hasn't signed that, and there is different reason due to that, but it's really important having different EU countries supporting small-scale farmers. But to you, Sarah, on the voluntary guidelines that you mentioned, you stated that 120 countries signed it. Did Sweden sign it? And is it enough to have such voluntary guidelines instead of advocating for a more binding rules?
Yeah, these guidelines were adopted by COFI, which is the Committee of Committee of Fisheries, and Sweden, as part of the EU, goes into those kind of negotiations or adoptions as an EU member state. And Sweden has actually been quite supportive of the guidelines and supporting FAO's work on implementing the guidelines. And they are voluntary in scope, but and that's why our main advocacy focus right now is to have them implemented and mainstreamed into national fisheries policy. So yeah, they are voluntary, but they're still signed. In this case, we are not really advocating for legally binding documents, but legally in the sense that if they are included in national fisheries policy, they will be legally binding.
Thank you. We have so many different policies and guidelines that tend to work in isolation. And I think it was really good with the morning presentation stating that it's really important to interconnect and show the connection. And Sam, you talked about that we can't really achieve climate change prevention and protection without actually securing the land rights of the communities. And we see that this commodification of resources have pushed a lot of indigenous local communities from their land, which has increased poverty in areas. Could you give us a little bit reflection towards this? Like what initiative can we do to ensure that we integrate the land issues with agroforestry and the water bodies? Because we all mentioned it one way or the other.
Thank you. I think the bottom line here is probably very important, is the free, prior, informed consent on indigenous people and local community rights. How are we going to engage with them, for them, for sustainable development or economic system development of their region without involving them meaningfully? And also, I think it's very important to speak the language that the local community can understand. In my community, we don't understand what the FPIT is. It doesn't come from us. No? And if you talk about, oh, let me tell you about REDD+. What is that? But that's very important that we engage them in the good principle is follow the free, prior, informed consent. So providing information in a good time manner, given all the pros and cons about any project or any regulations and any activity that would impact their livelihood, their ecosystem, their relation to the nature. So how do we make sure that we can implement that their rights will not be violated? And so very important discussion on biodiversity. It has to be related to ecological diversity and cultural diversity. So we cannot have a discussion on independently of each other. Maybe the safer way to do that is to really implement free, prior, informed consent, and then really talk to the community and the indigenous people. And then they will give you, I'm sure they will give you a lot of good advice that to make the policy, the system really work. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Merlin, you talked about agroforestry, and we have a question on which countries are in lead in agroforestry development. Can you give some factors why?
Mm-hmm. Agroforestry is agriculture tradition that has been I mean, including trees in agriculture has been there for as long as we have done agriculture. But in recent years, it's become more and more noticed that it is a practice that is useful for climate, biodiversity, and also for people. We are really trying to support the formulation of national policies. And India already have one, and Kenya is formulating one now. I'm not really sure how far that has come, but I think that they are quite far along in that process. And if countries choose not to have a separate policy for agroforestry, then at least include agroforestry and other diverse management practices in their agricultural policies and in their forest policies.
Thank you, Merlin. I think what you just ended with is really good, that they need to include in different policy the diversity of forests, the diversity of seed, the diversity of water bodies, but also the land rights. And we see that in the presentation in the morning, and now we talked about how the IPCC has shown what we already know, that we need to change the way we use our land, and the exploitation of our resources has to be changed. And in the first video where it says stop fossil fuel, that we need alternative, and we need to listen to community and even fund them. And one of the work that also Afrikagrupperna does in terms of supporting small-scale farmers is advocating for agroecology. And as agroforestry it's something that communities have been doing in generation, but it seems that the sustainability, we have been very slow in catching up towards that. And this can be implemented with the different policies that within Sweden that we push for in the EU, but also signing up different declarations. Just as we're about to finish, maybe if the three of you each can get like 1 minute just to sum up something that you couldn't say during the short time we had, but also everybody will get an opportunity to send you more questions in case more elaboration is needed. So we can start with Sarah. Any last word from the oceans?
It's difficult to summarize, but I'm just trying to create this picture of what is happening right now. And when we have the small-scale fishing communities, at the same time, they are squeezed in between the search for more and more resource and expansion of certain sectors, blue sectors like aquaculture or seabed mining, oil and gas exploration, port development, all these kind of sectors that are expanding. And the small-scale fisheries are kind of squeezed in between this. So establishing exclusive marine areas or zones where only small-scale fisheries have access to is something that I think is very important. So that's okay, that's my final word.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, Sam, on to you.
Yeah, I think this is maybe the good opportunity for all of us to come together, different expertise from different organizations. And we have brilliant indigenous people, their knowledge and the system will work better in the locally. We have the people, we have the knowledge, we also have the IT. So why don't we put them together, in a way that in the system that work really well. And also, whatever we do in any project, once again, I'm repeating myself, the free, prior, informed consent, this is the tool that has been developed for us. Why don't we do, applying that meaningfully, and so that this will not just, it will not be just like a tick in the box, no? Oh, we have consult them. We have consult this group of really important stakeholder in the climate solution, but to really learn from them, to learn that, really develop an idea, policy framework, and then plan that will work for them in their exploration, and in relation to the nature balance and their identity. And I think that would be very good way to go about. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Yes, I think prior consent is really important, and not only just participating, but also involving throughout the process. So they could also, communities could see the impact of projects. And a lot of land grabs and water grabs have been happening without communities knowing. It's just communities are informed as the last aspect, and it's really important to include communities from the beginning. And their decision also should be respected. Most of the time, even if they say no, it's lobbied towards what is thought to be either business-wise, yet good, or income-wise in terms of states. Yes, Marilyn, we will finish with you. What is your reflection, and what would you like to add towards it?
Yes, thank you. We are always very strong on working with local communities and local organizations in the countries where we work, and that is a huge part of the work towards a more sustainable future. But also I think that it's very, very important that we work cross-sectorial, that we find ways to work between or across the sectors. For agroforestry, this is very visible since it falls between forestry and agriculture. It's often very difficult to get our voices heard or find our place when we are working with agroforestry. And that goes for many, many other practices or other work that we do collectively towards a more sustainable future. So I think that is one of the huge challenges that we have, to find ways to work together, even if we are in different sectors.
Yes, I agree. We have all different priorities and also power relation and ownership. And I think it's a really good step that we start with this workshop, just to come together with our different ideology and perspective and try to find a common ground. And for today, it's biodiversity. That's one thing we all agree on. I would like to thank you all for your great presentation. I know time wasn't enough, but I think it's just like a tip of the iceberg, and people are really interested. And some asked if you could all share your contacts. And I think you could see the name on the participant, and then it's easy to search for the email, but please feel free to write it in the comments. So I'm Gloria from Afrikagrupperna, and Sam is from the Kenya facility, and Sarah is from the Swedish Society of Nature Conservation, and Merlin from the Agroforestry. So thank you all for your question and participation, and I hope you will enjoy the rest of the day.
I can just add that we can put the emails behind the names of the participants in the invite, so people can go back to the invite later today and see the contact information to everybody.
Yes, perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Well, thank you all, and thank you, Gloria, not least, for managing this hour. It was very rich and interesting. And I think just to wrap up, I think working together across sectors, but also I would like to emphasize our role as civil society actors in helping to amplify and make heard the voices in the policy dialogues on different levels of the communities and the stewards and people who are rights holders who have a stake in preserving biodiversity. Whatever the reasons. Okay, we have you noticed there's been 2 names added on the screen. To round off a rich day and long morning session, we have now 30 more minutes to look a little bit more at what is already happening in Swedish official development cooperation in relation to biodiversity and protection and promotion of biodiversity. And to do this, we have 2 invited guests. The first presenter will be Ulrika Åkesson. She's the lead policy specialist for environment and climate change at SIDA. And she will be followed by Sandra Ågren, who's a desk officer at the Division for Climate and Environment at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and specifically, I believe, also engaged in working with the Swedish support to the Global Environmental Facility, which is one of the main, one but not the only channel for support to international cooperation on biodiversity. So welcome to both of you, and we only have these 30 minutes, so hopefully there will be a little bit of a room for a few questions at the end. Otherwise, we will have to find a way for people's questions to be responded to afterwards, if there's not enough room. But Ulrika, well, will you start off and share your screen, please?
Yes. Thank you very much. I will now share a presentation. Let's see how this works well. There you go. Yes, can you all see? Göran, yeah? Yes. Great. I'm very happy to be part of this important workshop on biodiversity in relation to development cooperation. And I was asked to outline how SIDA, how the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, works on biodiversity in relation to what we do. I think you might be aware of this, but there are a number of implications of biodiversity loss in relation to development priorities. And I will mention a few to kind of set the scene. In terms of growth, jobs and income, natural resource sectors such as agriculture, forestry, fisheries are the bedrock of growth, jobs and income generation in many poor countries and for millions of poor people. And biodiversity loss undermines the productivity of these sectors and their continued ability to generate development benefits. When it comes to gender, for example, biodiversity loss means increased time and labor required for multiple tasks, and the burden often falling disproportionately on women and girls. When it comes to hunger, biodiversity loss means poor pollination, poor soil health, declining resilience, reduced availability of wild foods, reduced productivity of agriculture systems, and reduced nutritional security. It also has a lot of health implications. Means reduced access to traditional medicines, reduced options for future drug development, and increased disease burden. For climate change mitigation, biodiversity loss means reduced capacity for carbon storage and sequestration. In terms of adaptation, biodiversity loss means reduced adaptive capacity, resilience, and increased vulnerability. It also has implications on private sector investment, on conflict, security, but also, of course, and this is what I want to stress in terms of our work, of course, on marginalized and vulnerable people. And biodiversity loss can have a particularly severe impact on the most marginalized and vulnerable people, including indigenous forest dwellers, etc. And to many people, biodiversity is not just a source of subsistence and livelihood, but also an intimate part of culture and identity. So, biodiversity in development cooperation. A work stream under the Convention on Biological Diversity has been on biodiversity for poverty alleviation and development. And there are a huge amount of guidelines and tools developed to facilitate the integration of biodiversity in development cooperation in general and in sectors. And SIDA was early out in strategic work regarding biodiversity and development cooperation. And the first biodiversity guidelines were published in 1991, and then the work has continued. We also had environmental impact assessments mandatory since 1990s. In 2017, we strengthened our environmental management system at SIDA and have now both an action plan, environment action plan, environment policy to guide our work, as well as other mechanisms set up. And of course, biodiversity is included in this work. In our policy, we stress that SIDA commits to protect the environment and to proactively promote a transformation to an environmentally sustainable development by integrating environmental aspects in all operations and sectors. And with the following overall direction explicitly on biodiversity. It says that promotion of sustainable use of natural resources such as forests, land, water, and marine resources, with the objective to secure biodiversity and ecosystem services for increased resilience, poverty, alleviation, and development shall happen in our work. And the environment perspective is to be integrated into everything we support. And an environmental assessment should be done in close cooperation with the partner. And we assess the assessment by the partner, and going beyond do no harm, looking also at positive impacts of the program on the environment, as well then as on the negative impacts on the program on the environment and climate change, and how environment and climate change impacts the program. And biodiversity is becoming more and more part of what we see as goals in our bilateral, regional, global strategies that are guiding all SIDA's work. And we support initiatives at local, national, regional, and global levels through different actors, such as the public and private sector, academic institutions, civil society, etc. And I will give just one example here. We are supporting at global level the Rights and Resources Initiative. It strives to secure local rights to own, control, and benefit from land and natural resources. And research has shown, and this is probably not new to you, that indigenous people often play a key role in conserving biodiversity around the world. And this links to many SDGs, including Goal 1, no poverty, 2, zero hunger, 10, reducing inequalities, and 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions, apart from the biodiversity-related goals. In last year, through the letter of appropriation, we were to deliver actions as of SIDA, how we could strengthen and deepen SIDA's work on biodiversity. And we did so in a paper presented to the Swedish government 1st September then in 2019. And in that we drew, I think, some important conclusion for our work on biodiversity. We state there that the depletion of biodiversity is not limited to an individual sector, but requires a holistic approach. And that SIDA must work strategically with biodiversity within other sectors and areas, such as threats against environmental and human rights activists, corruption, illegal trade, education, health, market development, employment, and gender equality. We also stress that it is important to focus the work on rural and urban development, where the use of natural resources is central, and that we must work within sectors that relate to the use of management of natural resources such as land and forestry, urban development, water, and the marine sector. We also point out that the environmental management system provides an opportunity for SIDA to strengthen and improve the work on biodiversity. We also mention that a possible future initiative on biodiversity should be long-term and linked to existing strategies at global, regional, and bilateral level, and that the choice of strategies should be made in close consultation with CEDA. We also point out that given that the depletion of biodiversity is often transboundary, regional strategies have a great opportunity to develop and support more targeted efforts in the biodiversity field. We also say that CEDA can increase its support for countries' implementation of international conventions and commitments, as well as strengthen dialogue at national, regional, and global levels, including with banks and UN agencies and other donors. And finally, we also stress that there is a need for improved knowledge and capacity among staff within the agency and at the embassies. So that's something we are continuously working with. And then, of course, we can do a number of other things. We could look more at how to nature-proof investment, build biodiversity safeguards and incentives into development interventions. We could also invest more in biodiversity for development and climate resilience, and invest in conservation and restoration in ways that empower poor people, and also invest in elements of biodiversity that are important to poor people, like giving more attention to medicinal plants, soil biodiversity, traditional crop varieties, and important food species, and a lot of more of other things in relation to this. I just want to also mention something that I pointed out earlier. We have an environment management system, and we have a quite ambitious action plan. In that action plan, we have set targets for 2020 this year, where we wanted to reach when it comes to our environment work, biodiversity included. And in these ambitious targets then set for 2020, if we look particularly at biodiversity, we are measuring it with the use of the Rio markers that are set up by OECD DAC, so international markers. And when it comes to what we say principle biodiversity, or where we have a principal objective of working with biodiversity, we have already reached the goal set out on 4%. When it comes to this biodiversity as a significant marker, we are not there. We had set out the target to be 15% of all contributions that should have included biodiversity as more integrated into a program. And there we have a bit of a way to go before we're there. But to give you a bit of a flavor on what we are in terms of actual support and money related to biodiversity, our payments for biodiversity have increased between 2017 and 2018, and these are the last figures we have. We are by 1st September this year delivering 2019 support and those figures to the government, but those are not ready yet. So, but we increased from 2.5 billion to 3.1 billion when it comes to biodiversity related support, and that has tripled in relation to the baseline year 2010. And about 67% was allocated through bilateral projects and programs, and the remaining 33% were channeled through multilateral organizations. And the largest support in terms of programs supported was to the Ethiopian Institutional Strengthening Program in collaboration with UNDP, and then our support to WWF, followed by IUCN, SwedBio, and the Western Indian Ocean Marine Science Association. And the sectors that we support when it comes to biodiversity, the largest sector, general environmental protection, that is related to biodiversity policies, laws and regulations and so forth, followed by agriculture, 17%, forestry related programs, 15%, and then something called multi-sectoral, what's capacity development and so forth, and then 9% to government and civil society. And in this, we also measure how much of the support that goes, has gender integrated into the programs, and 90% of biodiversity marked initiatives were also gender equality integrated. And here you can see where most of the money goes, and that is our global support. 74% went through global programs, and followed by Ethiopia, Mozambique, regional Africa, Mali, and regional Asia. And then to finish off, I just wanted to mention that we have many very competent partners that we draw upon in our biodiversity related work. We work very closely with Swedbio, which is at Stockholm Resilience Center, the Stockholm Environment Institute, WWF, and the Swedish Society for Nature Conservation. Many of you hosting this workshop today. All names or organizations are not mentioned here, but also international actors such as World Resources Institute, IIED, agencies and universities. And I think this is what also gives us, improves our work on biodiversity, cooperating with all these very competent partners. And finally, a slide on what we have developed. We have under CEDA's external webpage a green toolbox where we collect a number of various works that we develop. I could just mention that we have developed briefs on biodiversity related to agriculture, to human rights, to urban development, Agenda 2030, and also last year a brief on a one-pager on our biodiversity related support in 2018. So I welcome you all to have a closer look at that. And with that, I hand over to Sandra at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Ulrika, for your presentation and for setting the scene, and thank you very much for inviting us to this seminar today. So my name is Sandra Ågren, and I work at the Division for Climate and Environment here at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. And I could just start off by saying that biodiversity is becoming an increasingly priority area for the government. And as an example of that, this autumn we will have a new colleague at the Division for Climate and Environment who will specifically work on biodiversity. Meanwhile, me and my colleagues are covering this area, and as Göran mentioned, my focal area is the Global Environment Facility, which I will present later in this presentation. But first of all, I would like to start off with talking a bit about what we do in biodiversity and ocean area. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization issued an assessment that found that global fisheries resources continue to suffer from severe overfishing, with more than 33% of marine fish stocks being fished at biological and sustainable levels. And to deal with this, we've given a contribution of 80 million Swedish kronor to the Blue Action Fund, who supports national and international non-governmental organizations in their efforts to conserve the oceans and coastlines in the developing world. And the Blue Action Fund's approach is not to create a new actor in implementing ocean conservation, but rather a new financial partner for NGOs who are successfully working in this field, to enable them to redouble their efforts with additional funding. And the fund mainly works with conservation projects in marine protected areas and their buffer zones, focusing on the most sensitive coastal waters of Africa, Latin America, and Asian Pacific. And if we could please move on to the next slide, I will talk a bit about the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, where we contributed with 50 million Swedish kronor to support the implementation of the Agreement on Port State Measures to prevent, deter, and eliminate illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. And this agreement is the first binding international agreement to specifically target illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. Its objective is to prevent, deter, and eliminate this kind of fishing by preventing vessels engaged in illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing from using ports and landing their catches. In this way, the agreement reduces the initiative of such vessels to continue to operate, while it also blocks fishery products derived from illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing from reaching national and international markets. So this is just briefly about what we do in the ocean area, and now I'm going to move on and talk a bit about the Global Environment Facility, which was established on the eve of 1992. The trust fund was established then, but it was the World Bank and the United Nations Development Program and the United Nations Environment Program who came together and established it in 1991. The GEF is based on different replenishment periods. We are now in the GEF 7 period, reaching from 2018 to 2022, where Sweden has contributed with a bit over 2 billion Swedish kronors. By that, we are the 7th largest donor in the fund, meaning that we also have our own council membership. And the GEF serves as a financial mechanism for 5 international conventions. The Convention on Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, and the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, and the Minamata Convention on Mercury. And if we please move on to the next slide, I'm going to talk a bit about this area. Thank you. So the GEF 7, as you can see here, they have 5 different focal areas: climate change, land degradation, chemicals and waste, and international waters. And last but not least, biodiversity. And you can see that 36% of the implemented programs and projects during GEF 7 has gone to this focal area. And the GEF provides financial resources for developing countries and countries with economies in transition to implement the Convention on Biological Diversity. The goal of the GEF biodiversity strategy is to maintain globally significant biodiversity in landscapes and seascapes. And to achieve this goal, GEF investments focus on 3 main objectives. That is, mainstream biodiversity across sectors as well as landscapes and seascapes. Also address direct drivers to protect habitats and species. And finally, to further develop biodiversity policy and institutional frameworks. And until today, the GEF has invested more than $3.5 billion to conserve biodiversity and use its sustainability. This investment has leveraged over $10 billion in additional funds, supporting 1,300 projects in more than 155 countries. And if we move on to the next slide, we can see a bit of how the GEF works. So the GEF doesn't have their own field offices, but uses GEF agencies who create project proposals and then manage the projects on the ground. In doing so, they help eligible governments and non-governmental organizations to develop, implement, and execute their projects. And just to mention a few, you can see here, it's the World Wildlife Fund, it's the Conservation International Union for Conservation of Nature, the UNDP, UNEP, and different development banks. And until today, in total, with all the focal areas that GEF works within, it has contributed with $14.5 billion and mobilized $75 billion in co-financing to over 4,700 projects in over 170 countries. And to round off, I'm just going to speak briefly about the GEF partnerships. It consists of 180 countries and the GEF agencies. But GEF also recognizes the role that civil society plays in safeguarding the global environment. And civil society stakeholders are encouraged to engage with the GEF by, for example, commenting on project proposals, commenting on policies, and supporting project implementation. And civil society stakeholders may also be part of the council meetings, taking part 2 times a year. And I would also just take the opportunity to invite you to contact me if you are interested in working more with us at the government offices and how we can evolve the Swedish policy within the GEF. And last but not least, the GEF has been working in partnership with indigenous people since its inception and was one of the first international financial institutions to develop an independent policy to engage with civil society, including indigenous peoples. So with that, I see we run out of time. I would like to thank you very much for listening and open up the floor for questions.
Well, thank you both. As you noted, we don't have many minutes left. We have 2 questions in the chat. Maybe you can answer one each. The first question is from a colleague in Finland who says that, can you give how the focus that SIDA and the Swedish Ministry has on biodiversity, how this has contributed to and benefited development cooperation in general? Maybe Ulrika, if you can take that one. And the second one is probably better for Sandra to address. Is there any indication of biodiversity remaining a high priority in the light of the likely, at least short-term, decrease in development financing due to the corona crisis? If you can comment very briefly on these 2 questions, that would be great. Thank
you. The benefits of, I'm trying to also read and see, a strong commitment on environmentalism and biodiversity on your development cooperation. Well, I think, as I started off with, there are so many development challenges and development goals that cannot be achieved if we don't integrate environment, including also biodiversity, in everything we do. And have that in the back of our minds. I think with showing also the SDG cake, as we say, as was my first slide, I think there you can also see that, of course, biodiversity related work is also a fundamental basis for also developing and or achieving the other development goals. So I think it's just very much strengthening our work when it comes to a sustainable development that we want to see happen in our partner countries and regions, and also on a global level. So that's a very general answer, but I think that's what I can leave it with at this point.
And Sandra, will you have any brief comments on the last question?
Yes, I can say that the conclusion on the Swedish government on how to strengthen the work on biodiversity that SIDA handed over to us last autumn, we're currently working on how we're going to take this further in dialogue with our colleagues at SIDA. And we see from our government side, we're going to continue strengthen the work on biodiversity further.
Thank you very much both for your contribution. Sorry that it was a bit short, but we are really stuffing these 2 half days with a lot of different perspectives and information. So thanks both. And to conclude, and thanks to everybody who has participated this today. We have been, as far as I can see, there's been up to 75 participants. We're now down to 57, but we've had quite a big crowd follow, and I hope we will have the similar or even greater numbers tomorrow when we will continue these discussions. We will look at more of, as I said, on the institutions and platforms and processes that regulate and impact on biodiversity. We will start with a presentation by the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of human rights and environment, and then we will have a more discussion about the Convention on Biodiversity with participants from the Environment Ministry and others. And then we will also look at the roles of business in human rights and biodiversity, and finally the future of aid and the overall role of biodiversity issues in the larger perspective and in the future. And we'll have the Assistant General Secretary of the UNDP, Ulrika Moder, as one of the live participants. So it's an exciting day tomorrow also, and I hope as many as possible of you will have the opportunity to log back in. We start at 8:30 tomorrow. Please note that.
Göran, Sorry, but I can add that the link to this video that we've done today, this webinar, will be available in the invite later today.
Okay. Thank you very much. And looking forward to seeing hopefully most of you tomorrow again. Thanks to everyone, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.